Hey guys, I want to talk to you about something today. We're going to talk about dispensationalism. Now, a lot of times when we hear that particular phrase, people get really excited and rock on and that type of thing, and then other people get really stirred up, and that's straight up heresy. First off, anytime you enter into these types of discussions, the first thing that you're going to have to do is kind of define the term. What is dispensationalism? Dispensationalism is basically just a way of saying that God deals with his people in different ways at different times. So for instance, looking at kind of the overall scope of things, overall scope of human history, we might look at this particular period that we're in, and a dispensationalist would say, okay, well, we're in the age of grace. Whereas we look at the period that maybe Moses was in, and we say, okay, well, this is the period of the law. And you look at these differently, and a lot of times, like I said, this does kind of have a tendency to stir up emotions and things like that. But the idea is that does God deal differently with his people at different times, and in different ways? And a lot of times the argument that comes against that is in Hebrews 13:8, which I'll just tell you what it says, so you don't think I'm making this up. So a lot of times the argument that's used against it is in Hebrews 13:8, and it says, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday and today and forever. And the idea is that Jesus is the same throughout history. So from the beginning to now to the end, Jesus is the same. And that creates another issue of, is this a conflict? Is Jesus the same, or is dispensationalism correct, where God changes how he deals with things? And this isn't a conflict. This is what's called a paradox, which basically the difference between a conflict and a paradox is a conflict is truly different views. I mean, they cannot be reconciled in any way. A paradox is something that on the surface appears to be a conflict, but as you look deeper into it, you actually find out that they're actually going in the same direction. And as we get into this, one of the things that I want to look at is we're going to look at Luke chapter 9, and we're going to start in verse 1. And he says, Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all devils and to cure diseases. And he sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And he said unto them, Take nothing for your journey, neither staves nor scrip, neither bread nor money, neither have 2 coats apiece. And whatsoever house ye enter into, there abide, and thence depart. And it goes on to kind of talk there, but one of the things that I want you to see here is that in chapter 9, Jesus is telling them, I don't want you to take anything with you. I'm going to give you power and authority over all things. And in this particular period, Jesus is teaching them to depend on him, depend on them for their well-being, for their safety, for their needs, both food and money and any sort of resources that they needed to survive, to depend on him. Then when we get to Luke 22, again, Jesus talking, in verse 35, we see, And then he said unto them, Jesus talking again, And then he said unto them, When I sent you without purse and scrip and shoes, lacked ye anything? And they said, Nothing. Then he said unto them, But now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. So one of the things that I want you to see here is that Jesus is actually conscious of the fact that he remembers back in chapter 9, he said, I'm going to send you guys out, and I don't want you to take anything with you because I'm going to provide for all your needs. Then he gets to chapter 22, verse 35, and he says, You guys remember when I told you not to take anything with you? Well, now I'm telling you, take stuff with you. And when I told you back in chapter 9, don't take a stave with you, which would have been a staff to defend themselves with. Now in chapter 22, he's telling them, now I want you to sell your cloak and buy a sword to be able to defend yourself with. So the point is that this, if I had no other passage in the Bible, if I had no other evidence, this would serve as sufficient evidence for me to see that God does in fact deal with his people in different ways at different times. So how does this tie into the Hebrews 13 passage, which basically says that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever? Because when you go back to the Luke 9 passage where Jesus is telling them not to take anything with them, this is kind of symbolic, or this is kind of reminiscent of the period where the Jews were being brought through the wilderness, and they had no food, and God was providing for them daily manna. It was a period of time where Jesus was teaching his people, and where God was teaching the Israelites at that time how to depend on him for their daily needs, both for their safety, for their well-being, for their food, for all of their resources. God was teaching them to depend on him. Then you get to Luke 22, and you see that God is not doing that. Jesus is telling them, you remember how I provided for you? Well, now you're going to be on your own. I'm going to be departing, because as Luke 22 is kind of closing up, and as we get into the later chapters, Jesus is getting ready to be crucified, and he's going to be departing from them, at least in the physical sense. So he's telling them, and he's preparing them. Back in chapter 9, I told you, you didn't have to take any of these things because I was here. Now I'm going to be gone, and now things are going to change. Now, regardless of how you look at this, regardless of what your opinion is on this, the fact of the matter is just in this one book, under this one author, by the same individual, Jesus Christ himself, shows two different ways in which God dealt with his people during different times. This is the essence of dispensationalism. However, this does not create a conflict with Hebrews 13, because in Hebrews 13, where Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, what we see here is we see a period of growth. In chapter 9, he's teaching his children dependence, and in chapter 22, he's letting his children go. No different than you removing the training wheels from your kids' bikes once they're able to actually be able to balance themselves and keep themselves going. God has now trained them, and he's starting to release them into the world. And then as we get to the end of Luke, the same author of Luke was the one who wrote the book of Acts, and we see as he goes on and talks about in Acts how those same individuals go on and progress, and so on and so forth. So there is a seamless connection between God's ultimate plan. It's one plan. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But in different periods of time, for different stages of growth within the believers, God did deal with his people in different ways. And this is the essence of dispensationalism. So we're going to talk about this some more in the future. We're going to talk about just various different subjects, things like violence, just war, things like this in the future. But I wanted to kind of lay a foundation that summarize the difference between a paradox and a conflict, and what dispensationalism is, because those are all things that we're going to get into as we go. So God bless.